The first scream came at 2:13 in the morning. Not the kind of scream that echoed for attention. Not the kind meant to call for help. This one was short, sharp, cut off halfway through. And then silence. A silence so unnatural that even the men sleeping behind concrete walls and steel bars opened their eyes. Because in Blackridge Penitentiary, silence was more terrifying than violence. Violence had rules. Violence made noise. But silence? Silence meant something had gone terribly wrong. Correctional Officer Daniel Mercer was the first to notice it. He had worked the night shift for 11 years, long enough to know every sound in Cell Block D. The rattled chains, the hiss of old pipes, the muttered threats from men who had lost too much to sleep peacefully. He knew which prisoners cried in their sleep and which ones whispered prayers into the dark. And he knew one thing for certain. At 2:13 a.m., Blackridge Penitentiary should have been locked tighter than a coffin. But when Mercer reached the corridor outside Cell 47, his flashlight trembling in his grip, he saw something he would later describe as impossible. The cell door was still locked. The bars were untouched. The security seal was intact. And yet the prisoner inside was gone, not hidden, not dead, not under the bunk or crouched in the shadows. Gone, vanished from a sealed concrete box under armed guard in one of the most secure prisons in the country. And on the bed, neatly folded, almost mockingly, was a prison blanket shaped like a sleeping body. Beside it sat a single spoon, bent, broken, and sharpened to a point. At first, the guards thought it was a joke. Then they thought it was a distraction. Then they found the blood. A thin smear across the floor drain. A few fingerprints near the vent. And written on the wall, in something dark and sticky, were 6 words no one in that prison would ever forget. You only locked the door. By sunrise, the prison was in total lockdown. By noon, helicopters were overhead. By evening, roadblocks had spread for miles. And by the next day, every major news station in the country was running the same headline. HOW did Elias Vale escape? Because Elias Vale wasn't just another inmate. He was the kind of prisoner wardens talked about in lowered voices. The kind of man officers watched a little more closely than the others. The kind of man who never shouted, never begged, never fought, never panicked. A man who, for 6 years, had done something almost no one in maximum security ever did. He had waited, quietly, patiently, as if prison wasn't the end of the story, as if he already knew something no one else did. And now he was out. No one knew where he went. No one knew how he did it. And the worst part? Somewhere beyond the walls of Blackridge, a man who had spent 6 years planning the impossible was finally free. And if the investigators were right, he hadn't escaped just to run. He had escaped for something much darker, something unfinished, something he'd promised himself he would return for, long before he became the ghost of Blackridge. Elias Vale had already become a legend, not because he was loud, not because he was brutal, and not because he carried the reputation of a man who enjoyed violence. That would have been easier to understand, easier to prepare for, easier to stop. No, Elias frightened people for a different reason. He was calm, too calm, the kind of calm that made grown men uncomfortable. At 38 years old, Elias Vale had the face of someone older, not because of wrinkles, but because of the way he looked at people, like he was measuring them, studying them, memorizing what they didn't realize they were revealing. He stood just over 6 feet tall, lean but solid. With dark hair, he kept cut short and eyes so pale they almost looked silver under fluorescent light. The guards used to joke that he looked like he belonged in an expensive courtroom, not behind bars in a concrete cage. But no one laughed for long, because Elias had been convicted of something that made even hardened officers keep their distance: kidnapping, extortion, conspiracy, and the murder of 2 men connected to an organized financial theft ring that had stolen millions before collapsing in blood. The papers called him a criminal mastermind. The court called him a manipulator. The lead detective called him the most patient liar I've ever met. But the one label Elias seemed to enjoy most was the one no one could prove: escape risk. Even before Blackridge, he had a history. A transport van once arrived with one cuff unlocked and no explanation. A county holding cell had a missing screw in the ventilation grate after a 3-hour stay. During trial, a courthouse janitor discovered a key impression molded in soap and hidden behind a toilet tank. Nothing ever stuck. Nothing ever completed. But every incident whispered the same thing. Elias Vale was always looking for a way out. And that was why they sent him to Blackridge. Blackridge Penitentiary sat far from the city, surrounded by miles of dead industrial land and low marshland that turned to freezing sludge in winter. It wasn't just a prison. It was a fortress designed to break the idea of escape before it could even begin. 3 perimeter fences, motion sensors, thermal cameras, floodlights, arm towers, electronic cell locks, steel-reinforced concrete, restricted movement, no loose tools, no civilian work crews, no access to maintenance corridors without double escort clearance. The prison's slogan, printed in bureaucratic paperwork and repeated by smug administrators, was almost comical in hindsight. Containment through certainty. What they meant was simple. No one gets out, especially not someone like Elias Vale. So when he arrived at Blackridge, they did what prisons always do with men. They fear more than they understand. They isolated him. Single occupancy. Limited recreation. No work assignment. No access to metal utensils. No close inmate contact. Randomized cell searches. Rotating guard patterns to prevent familiarity. For the first 6 months, Elias barely spoke. He followed every rule. Made his bed with military precision. Ate every meal. Never started trouble. Never requested contraband. Never challenged officers. He read constantly. Engineering books, old law manuals, plumbing schematics, biographies of military tacticians, weather almanacs, even outdated maintenance handbooks, whenever he could get them to the prison library request system. At first, nobody thought much of it. Prisoners read to pass time. Some read to escape mentally when they couldn't escape physically. But Elias didn't read like a man trying to disappear into a book. He read like a man studying for an exam. And every guard who watched him for long enough noticed the same disturbing habit. He remembered everything. Once, Officer Mercer casually mentioned during meal rounds that the boiler system had failed in B Block the previous winter. 2 weeks later, Elias brought up again, not conversationally, but precisely, asking whether the temporary repair had involved rerouting pressure through the old East Line. Mercer had stared at him. How the hell do you know there's an East Line? Elias had looked up from his tray and smiled slightly. You'd be amazed what institutions leave lying around. That was the first time Mercer reported him. It wasn't a disciplinary issue. There was no threat, no contraband, no broken rule. Just a note in the internal file. Inmate appears to show abnormal interest in infrastructure. The note was filed. Read. Ignored. Because that's how impossible things begin. Not with alarms. Not with explosions. Not with some dramatic movie-style scheme. They begin with tiny moments everyone thinks are too small to matter. A question here. A glance there. A memory no one should have kept. And over time, Elias Vale became invisible in the most dangerous way possible. He became predictable. The quiet prisoner. The polite one. The one who said thank you when trays were passed through the slot. The one who exercised the same hour every day. The one who folded his blanket exactly the same way every morning. The one who never caused paperwork. And in prison, the men who cause no paperwork are often the ones people stop watching closely. That was Elias's first real victory. Not stealing a key. Not breaking a lock. Not cutting through bars. No, his first escape was far simpler. He escaped their attention. To understand how Elias Vale escaped, you have to understand something about institutions. They don't collapse all at once. They rot in layers. Blackridge Penitentiary had been designed by people who believed architecture could solve human error. If you build enough barriers, enough redundancies, enough lock systems inside other lock systems, then no individual weakness would matter. On paper, it was flawless. Cell doors were electronically controlled from a central station. Movement logs were tracked digitally. Maintenance access required authorization from both a shift lieutenant and engineering staff. Ventilation shafts were too narrow for a grown man. Drainage systems were fitted with reinforced grates. The walls between cells were solid poured concrete, almost 3 feet thick in some sections. Even the windows were little more than slit-like rectangles of impact-resistant glass, too small for a child to fit through. Blackridge wasn't just built to prevent escape. It was built to humiliate the idea of it. And for years, it worked. No successful escapes. No major riots. No staff hostage incidents. It became the pride of the corrections department. Tours were given to officials. Reports praised its efficiency. Budgets were approved without much scrutiny because if it isn't broken, don't touch it. That phrase would haunt them later, because Blackridge was broken. It had just been broken for so long that everyone had learned to live around the cracks. Like most old institutions, Blackridge had secrets buried in its bones. The prison had not always been a prison. 40 years earlier, the site had been part of a government-funded industrial containment facility, a cold, ugly concrete complex used for storage, processing, and temporary holding during a manufacturing boom that collapsed almost as quickly as it began. When the land was repurposed into a correctional facility, much of the original underground utility network remained. Pipes, access tunnels, drainage junctions, emergency overflow shafts. Most have been sealed, rerouted, or documented as inactive. But inactive is not the same as gone. And Elias Vale, though he had never seen the blueprints in full, understood one thing that many engineers and administrators forgot. Every structure remembers what it used to be. The prison's infrastructure was a patchwork. New systems welded onto old ones. Modern security laid over aging foundations. Electrical conduits that no longer appeared on current diagrams. Drain channels widened decades earlier for industrial runoff. Maintenance access points bricked over, but not fully removed. It was a maze under the skin. And the people who ran Blackridge knew surprisingly little about it. Why? Because they didn't need to. Or at least, they thought they didn't. If a drain clogged, they called maintenance. If a pipe burst, they patched it. If a vent failed inspection, they replaced the grill. No one asked what lay beyond the visible system, because no one believed it could matter. That arrogance, quiet, procedural, bureaucratic arrogance, became Elias's greatest ally. But prisons don't only fail because of old concrete. They fail because of people. And Blackridge had plenty of weak points wearing uniforms. Officer Daniel Mercer was competent, but tired. Lieutenant Karen Holt was strict, but overloaded. Maintenance supervisor Ronald Pike had worked the prison for 17 years and signed off on repairs faster than he performed them. Night shift officers were often understaffed. Surveillance reviews were rushed. Routine inspections became ritual instead of investigation. In theory, Cell Block D received randomized searches. In reality, searches happened around staffing shortages, weather interruptions, transport schedules, and whoever was too troublesome to delay. Patterns emerged. Patterns always emerge. And Elias lived for patterns. He tracked footsteps, shift changes, meal delivery timing, the length of guard conversations, which officer tapped a key ring against his leg, which one checked the bottom vent during searches, and which one never crouched low enough to look, which maintenance worker smoked behind the boiler annex, which one left his tool bag open for just a little too long. Most men in prison count days. Elias counted systems. And the longer he stayed inside Blackridge, the more he began to see the prison not as a wall, but as a machine. A machine built by imperfect people. A machine with habits. A machine with blind spots. And if a machine has blind spots, it can be studied. If it can be studied, it can be predicted. And if it can be predicted, it can be beaten. The first real crack in Blackridge appeared in Elias's second year inside. It happened during a heavy storm in late November. Rain hammered the prison roof for almost 12 straight hours, overwhelming sections of the exterior drainage system. Water backed up through one of the lower service lines, causing a minor flood near the shower corridor. Maintenance crews were called.